Hi there, welcome everyone. Good to see you all this morning. We are just waiting for a few to join us from the waiting room. So it's brilliant that so many of you have managed to make it this morning. We're really delighted to see you all. Just waiting for a few more to come through and then we will get cracking. Thank you all for making time to join us this morning. My name's Anna O'Deedon. I'm Head of Knowledge at the Future of London, and we are really delighted that you've been able to make today's City Makers Forum. So the City Makers Forum is a platform for exploring key urban issues, and the aim of this platform is to build an extensive network of practitioners who are interested in shaping the future of our cities. The way we'll do this is through sharing experience and making connections. So you're all very welcome today to take part in that. City Makers Forum is part of a regular event series, and that's made possible due to a partnership between Future of London, so that's myself and my colleagues, and Hatch. So for those of you who are not familiar with Future of London, we're an independent network supporting those who work in planning, housing, regen and infrastructure. And Hatch is a consultancy which specialises in social and economic research into places and communities. And the thing that sets Hatch apart is that all of their work is underpinned by really strong research and evidence. So that's a little bit about City Makers Forum. Now on to today. The focus of today's forum is going to be London's green recovery. And we've chosen this topic because, well, as we start to shift gears out of the depths of the pandemic, now's a really critical time to consider how the UK and its built environment sector is going to recover. From the conversations we've had with the sector, it seems like there's a growing ambition for that recovery to be a green one, because whilst we've been focusing on the pandemic, certainly the climate change crisis has not gone away. So, over to today. Whilst we don't have a crystal ball to give you the answers to the big questions relating to the green recovery and what's going to happen after Monday when we all go back into some form of restricted socialisation, what we do have is a fantastic panel who are going to be sharing their thoughts with us on the green recovery. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers. We are going to be joined by Caroline Haynes, from Hatch. She's a director there with over 25 years experience, both as a consultant and as a political advisor. From TfL, we're joined by Morgan Dye, who's a principal city planner, focusing on air quality, environment and health. From the London Borough of Enfield, we have Nena Eke. She's the head of development there, where she's responsible for the delivery of the council's ambitious 10-year housing programme. And we have Kylie Bickford, who's design and technical director from Notting Hill Genesis. So thank you all panelists for joining us, and we really look forward to the discussions in a moment. Before we jump into all of that, let me just explain a little about how today is going to work. So we're going to kick off today by hearing from our panel. Each presenter is going to have 5 minutes to share their perspective on the green recovery. This is then going to be followed by a panel discussion where we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. We're aiming to wrap up by about 11 AM, at which point we're going to invite you to an online networking sessions. A few points to bear in mind while this whole session is happening. Please turn your audio and video off for the duration of the session. And throughout the session, we are going to be asking you to join in the Q&A, and you can do that by writing your questions in the chat. Please make sure you send your questions to everyone rather than just, for example, me. And please also remember to write your name and organisation alongside your question. And like I said, we've got our networking event at the end of the session. If you'd like to join that, we'd be delighted to have you. It kind of helps us to keep these events networky and vibrant, and we'll be sharing with you how you can do that at the very end of the session. And finally, we would love you to get involved during doing the old social medias. So our hashtags are City Makers, Net Zero London and Learning from Crisis. Great, so without further ado, we will pass over to our panellists. The first panellist we are joined by is Caroline Haynes from Hatch. So over to you, Caroline.
Technology. Good morning, everyone. So thank you so much, Anna. So as you mentioned, I'm from an organization called Hatch. which I think some of you who've attended previous events may have heard of. But Hatch is a global engineering and economic consultancy. So we got offices in around 70 different countries around the world. And we've set up an urban solutions unit that looks at urban economics, planning. We have some architects, and policy and political advisors, people like me. So the whole idea is that we can go and advise cities and places about agendas such as the green recovery that we'll be talking about today. So COVID is a subject very close to my heart, as I actually joined Hatch about 2 days after the lockdown began. So I've yet to actually go into our London office. So what I've been doing is actually leading our COVID work globally. And I think the one thing that everyone recognizes who's on this video call is in an age where we are totally obsessed with data, algorithms, AI, we're very logical. The one thing everyone really found, from individuals, businesses to governments, is at this moment of crisis, there was very little data available, whether from a health perspective, from a government perspective, from a behavioral perspective, and certainly from an economic perspective. So what we have been doing is working with clients to try and find different data sets to basically give a real-time view of what's happening in a place. So we've been looking at real-time insolvency data, commercial transactions, Barclaycard spending data, to begin to put essentially a dashboard together for places to begin to understand really how severe the decline was in the period of time during lockdown, and critically how things are recovering. So the comments I'm going to make are on the basis of having run this work in a whole variety of different places in the UK and some other parts of the world. And my observations are this. So the first thing is, I would say that, as we know, in the early days of the lockdown, what happened in many other parts of the country is there was almost a catastrophic shutdown because manufacturing facilities were closed, factories were closed, huge proportions of staff were furloughed. In some places we saw that was up to 50%. Now, what happened in London, and I'm not to say that there are individual personal circumstances that have been extraordinarily difficult and the impact on individual boroughs, some boroughs has been very profound, is at the aggregate level, because so many people worked in professional services. There was a greater proportion of people who were able to continue to work from home, myself included. And as a result, you had this sort of differentiation. Now, what we're seeing at the moment is different parts of the UK that really did go through this almost total lockdown are now actually, on the basis of the metrics that I talked about, they're actually almost getting back to normal. So as factories have opened, ports have opened, we're seeing even things like high street traffic and spending getting back to almost pre-COVID levels in some parts of the country. Now, the interesting thing is London, we're seeing a slightly different story, which is that it did survive a little, not survive, but it did a little bit better in the previous few months. But we're now beginning to see some hints of some structural changes. And some of those are concerning, but I also do think give some opportunity. So the first thing is, as some of you may, as I'm sure many of you know from the London boroughs, is there had been a pattern where 20 to 30-year-olds who usually had been sort of moving into London after they left university or school, and so there was sort of a net importation into London. The last 5-6 years, that trend had changed. So essentially more young people of that age group were leaving the city than were moving in. And in the last few months, it seems as if that pattern really has accelerated. So we're seeing large numbers of young people in that 20 age cohort leaving. And, I can sort of examples of that from Hatch. I mean, a huge number of our young research consultants have given up London flats and moved back with parents or families close by. And that's because there is this trend of hybrid working that really looks as if it's going to become the standard, where people go into offices about 2-3 days a week and work from home the rest of the time. The other thing is there has been the steepest drop in hourly wages in London than any other part of the country. And so, of course, that has a profound impact. And we know that, of course, many professional services firms that actually did ride out the wave and used furloughing look as if they're going to start letting more people go in October. So it does look as if the hit in the city, advertising, really will begin to trickle through. So that all, and I can talk more about that when we have questions. There are lots of issues around commercial property, residential house prices decreasing. But with that said, I don't bring this up to be incredibly negative, because actually with this comes opportunity. And I would say that, despite my accent, believe it or not, I was born in London and, sort of a Londoner. And I'd say the city has changed very dramatically over the several decades. I'm not going to reveal my age, that I have been from the city. And it really has gone through a period of corporatization. And I would actually argue that a lot of younger people have been crowded out. And that's why we've sort of seen this tidal change of people moving out. And I think with this period of time, it really does give us a sense to think a little bit about who is London for in the future. So every single city and place around the world is thinking about a green recovery. I was on the phone with a town in a Siberian peninsula yesterday, and they were talking about their green recovery. So I think, and I'm now out of time, but I think the challenge is really to think about who do we want the city to be for, to think about the next generation and what a green recovery means for the generations to come, and not just to think about essentially putting band-aids over parts of the economy right now, but to use this as a great opportunity.
Thank you, that's brilliant. And I look forward to the discussion where we can pick into some of those elements a little bit more. Really looking forward to your perspective on who London might be for and the positive changes that might come out of the current situation. Thank you, Caroline. So now we're going to move over to Morgan Dye from Transport for London, Principal City Planner, who looks after air quality, environment and health. So over to you, Morgan.
Hopefully everybody can now see and hear me. So I was on mute there when I kicked off. So just to introduce myself, I'm just going to set a quick timer here to make sure I stick to time. But just to introduce myself, my name's Morgan Dye, and I work at Transport for London in the City Planning Directorate. My team's called Transport Strategy and Planning, and we very much focus on the sort of strategic planning of transport in the city. We certainly have a lot of involvement in planning for things like walking, cycling, surface-based transport, but also the public transport network. We work very closely with colleagues at the Greater London Authority as well in the Mayor's transport team, and also in my case with colleagues in the environment team there as well. I'm here today to really sort of give you a bit of an overview and a flavour of the sort of thinking and work that we're doing at TfL, alongside colleagues at the GLA and increasingly with central government as well on a green recovery from COVID-19. So the beginning of this year, my roles changed quite substantially from focusing on things like zero emission zones and sort of delivering the Mayor's transport strategy and things like that, to very much focusing on sort of post-pandemic recovery. I think everybody on this call and everywhere else will have sort of seen the massive impact that the lockdown had on London overnight in terms of the plummeting levels of traffic on our streets, 95% reduction in passenger journeys on the tube and on the bus, and things like that. So massive transformations overnight, with streets basically emptying out, becoming sort of silent, and that discouraging of the use of public transport as well. And I think it's also been acknowledged that during that time we saw a lot of unexpected side effects from the pandemic, including much cleaner air, for example, but also people moving around the city in a different way, and a lot more sort of walking and cycling, people connecting much more with their local areas. And a lot of the work that I've been doing is looking at, now that we're sort of moving slowly out of the lockdown period, how do we ensure that London's recovery from the pandemic is green, sustainable? We use the term, or have been using the term, just, which is trying to sort of incorporate some of those sort of social equity elements of it as well. I think the pandemic's highlighted things that I think we already knew about, the massive disparities in sort of wealth and experience of living in London, and the pandemic disproportionately affecting different sort of community groups than others, and things like that. So it's looking at how we can sort of support the recovery of London in a green, sustainable and fair way. Above all, what we really want to try and avoid is a car-based recovery. There's obviously a massive risk, and I think, to be honest with you, we're seeing that sort of risk become a reality at the moment. A massive risk that as public transport use remains constrained, people will return to using the private car. And we really don't want that to happen. There's so many profound impacts that could be seen from that, including congestion, but also return to poor air quality, health impacts as well, with less active travel and things of that nature. So our green recovery that we're planning at TfL is aiming to sort of support much more sustainable transport within the city. And we're starting from a strong base, really, because we've got the Mayor's Transport Strategy that was published in 2018. And I think that really talks about the core elements of a green recovery already, to be honest with you. And I think what we're looking to do is, over the next 5 to 10 years, look at where we can build on that strong foundation and take it even further, looking at areas within the Mayor's Transport Strategy where maybe, if we were writing it today, we would be bolder. So things around sort of climate emergency and things like that, supporting the green economy, but also accelerating our work on walking and cycling. And hopefully people are beginning to sort of see some of that happen with some of the work that we're doing through the London Street Space Plan, with reallocating road space to walking and cycling and things like that, and supporting London's boroughs to deliver things like low traffic neighbourhoods and sort of local initiatives that will help support local communities, local town centres, local areas to travel sustainably and really avoid that car-based recovery. Oh, there's my timer. So I'll just wrap up by saying that we're sort of in the process of developing a green recovery vision and set of objectives, and those that vision and objectives will directly link into the work that the GLA are doing, the Mayor's London Recovery Board, and the work that they're doing as well. So that very much builds into some of the themes that they're looking at around sort of Green New Deal, 15-minute cities, and things of that nature. And we'll have more coming out about that, I think, sort of later in the year, where we'll sort of start to engage with the public and stakeholders to sort of get other people's views on what they want for a green recovery. That's it in a nutshell. I'll stop talking now, because I appreciate that I've run over by a little bit, but can take questions later.
Thanks, Morgan, and we don't mind a few moments of run over at all. So thank you very much for your comments, and we look forward to catching up in the panel discussion shortly. So now we're handing over to Nena from the London Borough of Enfield. Nena's got some slides, so we can also enjoy those, as well as her wonderful face. Over to you, Nena.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Nena Ormake, and I am the head of development at Enfield Council. Now, I always said, when you give a carpenter a problem, they will always turn it into a thing that requires a nail on the hammer. So being asked to look at the local authorities' role as leader and conveyor for the London's green recovery, I thought of a couple of things, including I'm sorry, I think
Hi, Nena. I think just having a little bit of trouble connecting there. Do you want to try again?
okay. If you can hear me now.
I think so. Perhaps I'll ask you to turn your video off, just as that might be taking up a little bit of bandwidth.
Bandwidth, yeah, that's a good idea. I will do that now.
All right, let's try again. Thank you, Nina.
Okay, all right, thank you. So let's see. So I think I was saying that if you give a carpenter a hammer, a problem, they will make it require a hammer. So that's me, carpenter, head of development, turning this into a development problem. So path to climate change. It's for me, it's about starting as a leader, adapting, and continuing. So Ollie, next slide, please. So in 2019, Enfield, like many local authorities, declared a climate emergency and created a climate emergency pledge, which at the top of the list is that we will become a carbon neutral organization by 2030. And we engaged with GreenGage to develop our climate action plan. I won't list everything there, about 5 minutes. So next slide, please. So the plan will be launched tomorrow, actually. So it talks about leading, about influencing, and about how you pay for it. So once again, engaging with what we can do as a local authority, what we can do with our residents, and what we can do with our partners. Next slide. Now, one of the things for me in my area we're looking at is ethical procurement, and that's how you procure a carbon neutral supply chain. So working with our suppliers, our contracting partners to achieve, and I've listed the aims from 2020 to 2022 of how we're going to try and aim to achieve this. We're also setting out a baseline, so we're doing some research about exactly the levels of carbon emission that we are in terms of our non-domestic buildings. We're looking at construction and the embodied carbon that's involved in that, and setting benchmarks so we can actually test how we're doing in terms of meeting the targets that we've set ourselves. Next slide. Now, in terms of adapting to change, well, we declared an emergency, we started producing a pledge, and then lockdown happened. And we've seen the effects of lockdown in terms of both unemployment and underemployment, creating a huge demand for affordable housing and more energy efficient homes. Because with people losing their jobs and being underemployed, there's threat of evictions, and there's also, as winter's coming, fuel poverty being an issue. It's magnified the dangers of overcrowding. We've already heard about public transport and the fears around increased car use. We've also seen the importance of actually physical activity, people being able to get to a park and having walking and cycling routes. We've seen how important our local shops and networks have been to us, but it's also kind of delayed construction starts and completions around the projects that are going to provide these homes and make sure that we are able to meet our targets. Build costs are going up due to supply chain insecurity. Councils who have spent a lot of money rehousing people homeless during the lockdown are now facing huge financial pressures because of it. In terms of actually getting things done, as you all would have seen yesterday, the settlement for London from the affordable housing program is 4 billion, which is actually a decrease from the previous settlement. So there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the grant rates are going to be going forward, and with be it a UVW shaped economy recovery that we're going into, recession recovery, sorry, it's most projections about sales is that it's flatlining. So essentially the need has been amplified by COVID, but it's also diminished the means of which we meet that need. Next slide, please, then. Now, so how do we build, how do we recover in a way that is green and build in green resilience? So in my team, we're looking at MMC and how we use that to ensure that we are optimizing energy efficiency, that both in terms of our domestic and non-domestic buildings, and we're looking at how we can possibly through a London Spire Club achieve economies of scale. We're looking at where the money can come from, be it a grant or low-cost loans to fund these things. In terms of our existing stock, we're doing a lot of retrofitting. So I've given some examples there of what we've done so far. Where in part of all of our regen schemes, we're looking at how we improve access to quality blue and green infrastructure. We're looking at how we support local economy to reduce travel, particularly car travel, and also with more people working from home and not in, and the moving away from city centers and looking more at local networks, how we support co-working, co-making, co-studying on our high streets and within our new builds. Ollie, next slide, please. And in terms of continuing, it's the fact that it's never a direct and straight journey, and you'll have your stops and starts. And the example I give is our Bury Street West side. We started out saying we were going to go for full passive accreditation, but we've learned we were already mid-design when we made that decision. So we've learned that you've actually got to specify really early in the design stage. We chose not to do full passive, but we are going for an equivalence to code level 5. We just started on site when we entered into lockdown. So it's been about remobilizing, trying to get the scheme going. And we're also looking ahead in terms of looking at our next pilot, where we are starting from ground zero with that design. We are actively engaging with MMC providers, contractors, and manufacturers to look at how we produce sustainable, carbon neutral, and cost efficient homes, both cost efficiency in terms of our delivery and future occupation. We're also looking at how we engage the community. So we're setting up a community review panel to co-produce our new design code, and that's going to focus on both placemaking and climate change. Ali, next slide. And just to kind of conclude, so our ambition is that we will be carbon neutral as an organization by 2030 and as a borrower by 2040. But we're going to achieve that by starting, which we have, adapting, which we are doing, and just carrying on through the stops and changes, and we will achieve that aim. And I leave you with a quote from Winston Churchill: "Perfection is the enemy of progress." So it's kind of just carrying on and continuing. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and I think that message you left us with from Winston Churchill, and also in your own words, the importance of course correcting and keeping going is such an important one, and one that we've heard time and again. And it takes kind of bravery to talk about those things, but it seems so important that we can all learn and make those changes together. All right, last but not least, we are moving on to Kylie Bickford from Notting Hill Genesis. So over to you, Kylie.
Hi, thanks, Hannah. So yes, I'm Design and Technical Director in the development team at Notting Hill Genesis. Notting Hill Genesis is a leading London-based housing association, and we own or manage about 60,000 existing homes in the capital. We've also got a strong development pipeline, which is around 1,400 new homes per year at the moment, and those are both a combination of affordable and social and private tenures as a sort of cross-subsidy model. I'm going to focus on the challenges associated specifically with energy efficiency and carbon reduction for London's housing stock, particularly new build from a housing association perspective. And what I would say with the housing association perspective is I think the speakers so far are looking at quite a strategic level, whereas I think on the housing association side, our primary focus is on the delivery. So the housing associations are both developers and landlords, and we operate as a business, but we have social objectives. And so that very much informs the perspective on green issues. And I think the key role of housing associations on green issues is to take the ambitious government policies that have been put in place and will continue to evolve in future, and translate those into effective practical solutions which work for our businesses and which work for our customers and residents in real life. So that's really the sort of the crux of my my focus today. I think in terms of the green recovery, prior to COVID, the government trajectories on energy efficiency and carbon reduction in housing was already in place. And I think prior to COVID, the environment in which the industry was trying to deliver on those policies was already pretty challenging. So we have to contend with Brexit, with slow domestic sales demand, with post-Grenfell fire safety agenda, which has been very demanding. And so the green agenda, I do think, has sort of struggled to maintain a specific profile amongst the other strategic priorities, even though it's always been in the mix. And I think the COVID pandemic has introduced some additional operational difficulties, economic uncertainties, housing market uncertainties that make for an even more challenging environment. So when we talk about a green recovery, I think it's a nice political narrative, but I think if I think pragmatically about the delivery of that, I think that what we can hope for at the moment is more around maintaining the previous trajectory and not allowing ourselves to be blown off course, rather than necessarily trying to improve that trajectory. That's a difficult one. In the current environment. So certainly I feel for my role within Notting Hill Genesis, it's about how can we maintain that business as usual and maintain that focus and keep trying to deliver new energy efficient homes in the most effective way for our customers, because it can be easy to get sidetracked at this moment. In terms of delivering those new homes to be low carbon, the GLA planning policy requires new developments to have 35% minimum of the improvement on building regulations delivered through on-site carbon reduction measures. And there's various sort of solutions to achieving that. One of the things that I do in my role is to consider the different options against the various priorities that we have to try to identify the most optimal solution for achieving that carbon reduction. So our two key tenets for that are firstly that any energy solutions should seek to benefit Notting Hill Genesis customers in the best way. So that might be to do with household running costs and service charges, or the comfort and well-being in the home, and also to create value for money for Notting Hill Genesis. So that would include efficient capital expenditure, maximising value returns, minimising ongoing operational costs for housing management. And the main area for debate is usually the heating solutions. So we've kind of moved away now from gas boilers and CHP towards heat pumps. And I think that's a really big thing for the industry at the moment. That was pre-COVID and will still exist post-COVID. Is how do we decarbonise heat? And I think the industry is trying to get to grips with the best way of implementing heat pumps, which are not an entirely new technology, but they're being used in a new context in the UK residential, often high density context, and that's quite an uncharted territory. So I think the challenges that we're facing for new homes delivery on carbon reduction, I don't think have really changed through COVID. I think they existed pre-COVID and they still exist now. And some of those challenges are, for example, the high cost of building to the standards. That can often mean when you've got lots of different things to try and juggle, that some difficult choices have to be made about how to spend a development budget. There's also this difficulty of having to deploy new technologies. We've been doing this for years, deploying new technologies, new construction types, in which is something that's largely a trial and error manner. And residents are the ones that really get impacted when things don't go according to plan. We do everything we can to make it a success, but I think it does have to be acknowledged that carbon reduction on paper isn't always a big success story in reality, and that there are there's collateral damage on that, where residents end up with maybe heating systems that don't perform as they should, and so they're subject to higher costs, or there are unintended consequences, for example overheating. And I think that those of us who are delivering on the ground, our role is to try to ensure that, as I said before, we're delivering things in the most effective way for those residents and customers. And I'll draw to a close there.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Kylie. Right, well, we are moving now over into our kind of panel discussion and then on to the audience Q&A. So if you haven't already had a chance to pop your questions into our chat box, please do that now. And of course, you can continue to add while we're having our panel discussion. So I'll invite our panelists to turn their video and their audio back on now. So we're all on screen. And I'll come to Caroline first. Thank you for your brilliant insight into the kind of the catastrophic impacts that the shutdown had at the very beginning of the pandemic. I was interested in particular in your comment around commercial properties within the city centres changing, and also your mention of residential property prices changing as a result of the pandemic. And I wondered, what are the impacts of these changes on the kind of the shape of London?
Well, it's such an interesting question, and because the makeup of London is so unique compared to lots of other big major mega cities, I would say, because we're really a hub and spoke. You know, literally we've got the M25, everyone travels from different boroughs into the centre. And as a result of a whole variety of different changes, of course, we've had this very, very hot property market in the middle of the city that essentially really has functioned to provide investments for big pension funds and for big international infrastructure and property companies. And so that's when I made the comments about, sorry about the noise, it's always construction happening. So when I talked about the fact that there has been a corporatization, there has in a certain extent, because you can't build a building like that unless you've got tenants that are actually incredibly sort of secure in the long term. And that means it has to be a Pret or someone with a big balance sheet. So I think the really interesting point is we've seen a variety of some of the big businesses, so whether it's Barclays, NatWest, saying, actually, do we need these iconic buildings anymore? Because they're all having to worry about ways of shoring up their balance sheets. Now, that's fine in terms of, as I said, hybrid working, because they realize that that does work, that both people prefer it. And also, they actually have seen that people are productive working at home. But there is a big question about actually what happens to all of that, you know, sort of empty property, because a lot of it is very specific, it's very expensive. The developers, of which there are lots of people on this call, I realize, who are having to maintain debt. So it's not that easy to basically just change things. And there also is an implication in terms of all of our pensions, public sector pensions, private pensions that are invested in these properties. So it is actually quite a complex question to untangle it. Residential is a little bit easier, but on the commercial piece, I think it's something we'll be tackling and grasping with, I suggest, for several years.
Thank you. And actually that relates to a question that we've had in from one of our audience members, from Chris Hageman. He mentions your comment about the 20 to 30-year-old professionals who are moving out of London. And he wants to know if there is a danger that those on lower incomes in affordable housing will have less flexibility to leave and maybe left behind. And I think this perhaps relates, Morgan, to your comment about the necessity for a green, sustainable and just recovery. So let's go to Caroline first, and then we might come to Morgan after.
So the first thing I would say is when we were net importing 20 to 30-year-olds, so in previous periods, it was not just young professionals. So it's people wanting to be, you know, young chefs, looking at social care roles. I mean, it really was the whole gamut. And so what we're seeing is the outflow actually covers all of those different areas as well. But the point that Chris is making about the fact that some people may end up, I don't want to use the word stuck, but they may have fewer choices and less flexibility in terms of the choices they make, is a real one, and it's one that we need to be cognizant of.
Great, thank you. So Morgan, let's move to you now and talk a little bit about the ambition for the green, sustainable and just recovery. I was curious to know, are there any specific examples beyond, you mentioned of course the London Street Space Plan, but are there any specific examples across any London boroughs that have already been implemented or soon to be implemented that really do support that ambition for a green, sustainable and just recovery?
Yes, I think there's been quite a lot of work going on before COVID, because I think there was always the sort of the growing concern around the climate emergency and the acknowledgement that London's air quality was incredibly bad, and right up into the pandemic, it was still sort of exceeding legal limits in many areas. But I think examples of what we as TfL already been. Oh,
I've just turned your video off as you were breaking up, so carry on.
Okay, fine. So I think some examples of what's already been going on is you can see immediately after sort of lockdown began to ease, there were sort of examples of quite rapid action to sort of support and try and lock in that active travel element of things, with sort of widening pavements, giving over big chunks of major roads like Park Lane, Euston Road to cycling, and those sorts of improvements. And I think that sort of built on a lot of the work we had already been doing around cycling, with the delivery of some of the sort of major cycle routes in central London, which certainly my experience of cycling around both during lockdown and afterwards, those have become very busy in some respects, which is really positive. I think we've seen the impact of the ultra low emission zone in central London, which has really helped to improve air quality there, and it's still on the cards at the moment, and still the intention to expand the ultra low emission zone to cover much of inner London within the north-south circulars as well. So that was something that was sort of already very much on the cards before COVID. And I think that's the thing with the way we were thinking, certainly as TfL, and I think you can, and certainly the same with the Mayor and the GLA as well. I think you can see in the Mayor's transport strategy a lot of that ambition to create a greener, fairer city. A lot of the language in that, predating COVID, was sort of already there to enable us to sort of build on that. And I think a lot of our attention at the moment is looking at how we can accelerate some of the things we already have planned, deliver them a lot quicker, but also look at where we can be bolder, perhaps, as well. And also looking, I think we talk a lot about walking and cycling, and that sort of travel, but also looking at what we can do with the public transport network to sort of rebuild trust in that, because the public transport network is still sort of second to none in London, and we will need that to help us deliver a sustainable green recovery. We need to sort of encourage people to return to public transport when it's safe to do so. I think it will remain subdued numbers for quite some time, because we don't know what's going to happen over the winter and so on. But yeah, I think there's already been a lot of activity that's been going on across London. It's about sort of building on that and accelerating it.
Great, thank you. And actually, that acceleration point you mentioned relates to a question from Kiara Hansen, who has asked, what do you expect the big wins or the immediate actions to be that will act as those catalysts for the green recovery? So beyond anything that you've mentioned that kind of existed pre-pandemic, are there any thoughts or suggestions of what those catalysts might be at this point?
Well, I think you're beginning to see it from the delivery of the London Street Space Plan, and that sort of very rapid reallocation of road space to more sustainable modes, whether that's sort of significantly widening pavements to aid social distancing, or whether it's putting in segregated cycle lanes like we've done on Park Lane to make people feel immediately more comfortable cycling. I think there are a few initiatives as well, which they weren't TfL initiatives. I think one of them was the Royal Parks, where they closed the mall that leads up to Buckingham Palace. I remember cycling down that in sort of June, I think it was completely closed to traffic for a number of weeks. I think it's reopened now, which was last time I went down there, which was a bit of a shame in some respects, because I just remember cycling down there and just thinking it was so enjoyable. And I think those sorts of things where you're quite rapidly and boldly reimagining how you allocate street space will be quite important, because I think the worrying thing we're seeing at the moment is that traffic levels are, I think they're about, in inner London at least, about 95% of what they were before lockdown. So you really can see that people are returning to sort of using their cars quite significantly. We've seen upticks in walking and cycling as well, but I think the big wins, the immediate actions, will be creating the right environments, I think, that people choose to walk and cycle, particularly around their local area, so that we don't sort of then have another problem to deal with in terms of unpicking congestion, again having to tackle poor air quality and also the health implications of being sort of less active if you're using a car. So I think it's those sorts of initiatives that will sort of encourage more active travel in the immediate term.
Great, thank you very much. Now let's move to Nena and Kylie. A question for you first, Nena. You mentioned the plans launching tomorrow, so that's very exciting news. And you also mentioned that ethical procurement was a really important part of your job role. I wonder how we can support R&D and innovation within this supply chain space in order to deliver against that, and particularly in the context of the pandemic. What can you do to support that?
I think it's actually looking at the less traditional means of procurement. So we tend to pivot towards frameworks and avoid the big kind of OJU procurements, because we're oftentimes, by the time you're out to procure, you've got 3 months to get through, and you've got grant funding and all the other things that are driving your need to be on site. But actually looking at how, and there actually are a number of new frameworks for MMC, for example, that we are now able to rely on. But it's also kind of looking at other arrangements that allow you to capture some of what's going on in the industry. So, where there are manufacturers, producers that are coming up with innovating ideas. And I guess one of the things that a local authority can do that other developers cannot is actually kind of test those ideas and kind of we aren't worried about we're not as profit focused, and so we haven't got the 20% profit on GDP to worry about and all the rest of that. So we can take a bit more risk, but we, just like any other developer, we've got our hurdle rates to meet. We've got cost benchmarks that we've got to keep to. We've got grant obligations that we've got to meet. But it's starting early. It might be, so it's starting before you hit that kind of crunch period, engaging with the market, giving opportunity for both in terms of your designers, your contractors, and technicians to come up with innovation, to give those kind of ideas a test bed, a pilot scheme to trial on, and I think that's a role that local authorities can play.
Great, and I suppose that a similar question then to Kylie about delivery. In particular, you mentioned the necessity to not be blown off course by the pandemic and everything that it's brought with it. And you mentioned some particular challenges, such as the high cost of building. So within the context of potentially supporting R&D and innovation that is in the spirit of the green recovery, what are your thoughts from your side?
So I guess there's a couple of concerns. One would be the fact that there are a lot of different demands on developers, and the green targets, the zero carbon energy efficiency, is just one part of it. And until now, I think developers in London have managed to absorb quite a lot of the requirements, but I think going forward it's going to be more and more difficult, and that could be where, for example, in order to achieve zero carbon, the proportion of affordable housing on a development goes down because a developer is not able to deliver everything as part of that project budget. So I think that's one concern, is the competing priorities and demands in a difficult economic environment. And I think the other aspect is what we definitely saw after the 2008 crash was that there was a period of time when the construction quality was affected by contractors trying to cut costs because they had maybe tendered for work at a time when they then couldn't sort of support that price that they had put forward. My concern, and one of the areas I think for focus for us going forward, is to make sure that when we are delivering those energy efficient constructions and technologies, that we're keeping tight control on potential for cost cutting, because that's where quality will suffer, and then the resident experience at the end of the day will suffer, and the actual carbon objectives won't be delivered in practice.
Great, thank you. And one to both Nena and Kylie from Chris Hageman. He says there's a general perception from residents that heat networks, etc., are more expensive and more complex and less controllable. So given everything we've spoken about, how do we build resident trust in low carbon technologies? So I don't know who wants to take that one first.
I think having just had recent experience of that, I think there's a lot of training to do for both residents and our own operatives when we're putting new technology into a building. Where both our repairs and maintenance operatives need to understand what's in the building when they are taking care of it. Our tenants need more than just a welcome pack that has huge manuals in it that they then need to decipher on how to use. So
it's not a new emergency.
Being able, I don't know what happened there. So being able to kind of educate them early before they get the keys to their new home and are then faced with all this technology. Being able to educate them early. Actually, also looking in terms of the cost. I think local authorities and housing associations have a huge buying potential. So looking, I think we don't actually really make use of that. And I did talk about the ideas of a London's Buyers Club, of how we achieve economies of scale, and that way we are able to pass on that savings of to our end users and our residents.
Thanks. Kylie, have you got anything to add there?
I guess I would just say that heat networks generally are more expensive, are more complex, and are less controllable for the people who have to live with them. Not in all cases, but I don't think as an industry we've delivered heat networks very well. I think it's a sensible policy for future, but I think the implementation has been quite poor as an industry, and I think we do need to learn from that. And the problem is, as soon as you lose residents and customers' trust in things, it's very difficult to get it back. But that's just the situation that we're in, because it is, as I said before, a sort of trial and error process that everyone is learning together as we try to improve on both the design and construction of heat networks and the maintenance of heat networks, develop those supply chains, develop the knowledge and understanding, because that's what a lot of it comes down to, is just a lack of knowledge across both the design side and the maintenance side, in addition to, as Anna was saying, sort of understanding for occupants as to how to operate things effectively.
Great, thank you. All right, well, one final question from Susan May, and this is to all of our panelists. So we'll start with Caroline and Morgan, and then move across to Nena and Kylie. So Susan May says, two of the most challenging aspects of a green recovery are firstly deciding on the goal and timescale, and secondly plotting a series of sensible stages in order to achieve this. The first often happens in her observation, but there tends not to be a good idea of all of the stages an organisation has plotted in order to get there. Can the speakers provide a perspective on how we manage that tension between ambition and the stages to get there? So Caroline and Morgan, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure, let me jump in. So I think it's a very, very fair question, and people do talk about the ambitions, and they talk about sort of plans and strategies, and it's very, very difficult to move them into concerted action at a city level. So absolutely what Kylie and Nena have been talking about. So at an organizational level, absolutely people can play the role, and TfL as well. But I think that it comes back to that question is, we sort of run into the whole green thing, as everyone is doing, without really thinking what is the end purpose here. So we've been talking about things like transport. As I started to say earlier, we are a hub and spoke city. There is no way that I'm ever going to be able to bicycle or walk into work. It's just never going to happen. So I do depend on public transport, cars, things like that. So I think that there needs to be a pause to think about what we want, as a city, whether that's actually leveling out some boroughs, so actually distributing elements across different places, so we don't have the press, the media, the city, lawyers, all in the same concentrated part of London. And I think we need to be a little bit more creative about some of that thinking. The reasons that, you know, and actually building a consensus around it at a city level, because getting back to the question, only then do we get to the point where actually we've got some actionable things that people buy into. Because otherwise, you know, what we hear is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of words, and they're very well meaning. So I'm not trying to say otherwise, but it's very difficult to see how they do actually translate into hard, practicable action. And I think that's the reason that so often these strategies fail.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And just for the other panelists, I'm sorry to rush you, I'm conscious of time, so a few quick comments if you don't mind. Thank you, Morgan.
I think you're right. I think we've got sort of a rough idea of the sort of goals and timescales and what we sort of want to achieve with green recovery, aiming over the next 5 to 10 years. I think that point on sort of how that pans out in reality at a city level is an interesting one, and I think that's a stage that we're at now, is properly sort of planning out what that means in reality and how we're going to achieve that, and what it means for different parts of the city, because like was mentioned, not everybody can cycle all the way from somewhere like Bromley into central London, or they might be less inclined to do so. And I think that's very much like where we need to be looking holistically at the whole transport network and how that can support that green recovery and support those goals. And I think that's very much the stage that we're at the moment, is trying to really map out how we are actually going to achieve a green recovery, so that it doesn't just sit as a sort of a policy narrative that sort of never really goes anywhere. So I think that a key next stage for us is developing those objectives to sort of look at how we achieve that in reality, and within the reality as well of a very, very tough financial situation for TfL and just the economy generally, and sort of being realistic about what we can achieve over the next sort of 5 to 10 years to make sure that we do achieve a sustainable recovery.
Thank you, Morgan. And Nena and then Kylie, just very quickly, I'm conscious of time, so.
Yeah, so I would say that, well, our climate action plan, it does try to do that. It tries to break it down into near-term and longer-term objectives on a year-by-year basis, and laying out the actions that we will take. But Enfield is just one borough in London, and I do take Caroline's point that, you know, it's that getting it at the citywide level is where we need to get to.
Great, thank you. Kylie?
I would just say that I think a lot of, for the housing associations and other sort of businesses on the operational side, a lot of what we deliver is in accordance with government policies. So I'd just say that we sort of hang off that. So I'm not so sure how helpful I can be to this question.
Great, thank you.
It's a great way to finish, isn't
Well,
it?
you've been very helpful in all the other questions, so thank you to you and to all of our other panelists. It's been a real pleasure to spend this morning with you. I'll bring the event to a close now. And yeah, thanks once again to our wonderful panelists and to you, our audience, for all of your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to answer yours particularly. We just had a lot coming through. If you're keen to hear more about our related programmes, then do check out Future of London's website, where we'll have all of the upcoming events listed. And just to say, we're particularly excited about Future of London's first ever digital conference, which is coming up on the week commencing the 26th of October. So please do join us for that. We'll be talking behaviour change, we'll be talking funding net zero. So lots of the topics that we spoke about today will be discussed in kind of different contexts and in greater detail. And in addition to our Achieving Net Zero conference, we also have a number of Learning from Crisis events coming up. On the 29th of September, we're going to be discussing parks, public green space, and how we can make these spaces more inclusive for all. So that relates to some of the discussion we had earlier about making the green recovery a just recovery. And then on the 1st of October, we'll be exploring post-pandemic house building. So picking up on many of the themes that Nena and Kylie spoke about today as well. Right, so moving now on to the breakout rooms. Before we do, just to say we'll be following up today's event with a feedback form, and we really would appreciate you letting us know how you found today's event. It helps us improve for next time. So yeah, so onto those breakout rooms. Shortly, you will see on your screen in front of you a button that says go to breakout room. If you'd like to join us to continue these conversations, all you need to do is simply click on that button when it appears, and you'll be taken away to another room, and you'll be randomly allocated with some wonderful colleagues to have a discussion with and to continue the conversation. Make sure you've got your video and your audio on when you're in that room, and when you get there, please do introduce yourself, your organisation, and perhaps chat about some of the key learnings from today's sessions and those things that you'll be taking away into your day-to-day work. All right, so without further ado, I'll say goodbye. Thank you once again for joining us.